Okay, I'm back. This is the fourth installment of my record collection. I've gone through and I've talked about each of the top cubbies, and this is the last one. Coming into the next cubby, kind of as an overture, we have soundtracks that bleed into classic rock from the 70s. And to start this all off, I do have a strange oddball album that I didn't really know where else to put, and that is Garbage's album of Push It. And it's just the single for Push It. It has a lot of different mixes on it, a lot of different takes of it. I think DJs would use this in raves and EDMs. And so I love that song growing up, and it was one that when I saw it in a used record store, I'm like, I have to have this because it was such an integral part of my music listening experience when I was a kid. I just have to. And speaking of essential music listenings as a kid, I have my Weird Al collection. His first album, I found this at a used record store and I had to get it. I then have his next release of Weird Al in 3D. And then we have a more recent release from Weird Al, and that is Alpocalypse. This might be one of my favorite albums that he's released in recent decades. And then I finally have his final album. This is a great way to kind of cap off his career if this is where he wants to stop. I know that his contract has ended with this 15th album, so I know that he's kind of taken a break or is retired from at least producing albums. I know that he's still doing a lot of work elsewhere. From there, we go into soundtracks, and I jump straight into my favorite all-time musical, Phantom of the Opera. Even though Andrew Lloyd Webber kind of blatantly stole the main theme from Echoes from Pink Floyd for the overture as well as Phantom of the Opera, we'll let that slide. Still a fantastic record, and the songs on here are just superb. From there, we have my second favorite soundtrack Broadway musical, and that is Jesus Christ Superstar. This is the one that has the original London cast, and it has a lot of amazing performances from Ian Gillan from Deep Purple. I know that there's a lot of different renditions of this recording, but this one's one of my favorites. From there, we go into a more recent one, and I've already talked about it, and that is Wicked. This guy was a huge impact of my, I guess, high school career. I would also draw your attention to Hamilton. This is my current obsession for musicals at the moment. Fantastic, brilliant. You have to listen to it if you haven't already. So then we move away from the Broadway musicals, and now we're coming into scores and musical soundtracks. And to start us all off, we have Danny Elfman's Edward Scissorhands. This guy is one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. On the other spectrum, we have Beetlejuice. Now this one is just pure chaos and pure fun, and it's kind of the flip side to Danny Elfman's music. I find that he blends the chaos with the melodic very, very well with those two soundtracks. Then we come up to How to Train Your Dragon. A masterpiece movie, and a lot of that has to do with the soundtrack. It's just so flowy and so organic. It's very rooted in a Celtic feel. Then we have the soundtracks to Kill Bill. I've got part 1 as well as part 2. Both have fantastic music, great compilation albums. I'm not a big fan of compilation albums, but what I am a fan of is soundtracks. So both of these guys have some fantastic music on it, and each one has a completely different personality, and I love that for it. Then we have one of my favorite soundtracks to my favorite movie of all time. People ask me what's my favorite movie. The answer, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. This guy came out at the perfect time with the perfect amount of everything. I mean, for me, this movie was a perfect movie when it came out, and the soundtrack to it is just fantastic. This guy followed me all throughout my master's degree. Then we go into a little bit of a guilty pleasure, and that's the soundtrack to Godzilla, the 1998 movie. You'll see it actually came with the DVD up there. But this guy, my dad and I actually bought the cassette when we did a road trip across Western Canada. We landed in Alberta and we drove from Calgary all the way across to Victoria Island. So this guy was following us through the entire time, and whenever we were listening to this, we always remember of like the road trip, the mountains, the trees, the beautiful scenery. Then we come to my favorite soundtrack from this past year, and that is La La Land. I've already talked in like long stretches for why I love this album, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. You can find a lot of that already on my channel, but just a fantastic soundtrack and one that I can't help but love. Then we come into the soundtrack to Interstellar. I've talked a lot about this album. It is one of my favorite purely instrumental soundtracks because it's the score and just the depth of the organ. It's very reminiscent to say 2001: A Space Odyssey, but just the overall mood is just so beautiful when you're capturing the vastness and the unfathomable essence of space. This soundtrack really holds that. Next up, we have the soundtrack to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? This is an oddity to my collection if you've kind of followed along up to this point, but I love these kind of just completely different sounds. This is more of like the beginning of rock and roll, and so a lot of that is permeated on this album. The final soundtrack that I have is Across the Universe. This is a reinterpretation of a lot of, well, it's all Beatles music, and Across the Universe was one of my favorite movies when I was in university. It still is to this day, and I love all of these songs that are on here. From there, we go staying a little bit within the soundtracks, but keeping it with the Beatles, because now we're in the Beatles territory. We have the soundtrack to the Cirque du Soleil show, Love. This guy is one of my favorite reinterpretations of any kind of music. And if you haven't already listened to it, do yourself a favor and get out and listen to it. Now from there, we go into my Beatles records. Now I already have all the Beatles records in the Beatles box set. I keep that kind of over to the side of my collection, and I might talk about that a little bit more in depth. So the albums that I have, I either inherited from my father or they were albums that I picked up before I got the box set. So the first one is actually one of my favorites from the band. It's the soundtrack, staying with the soundtrack. It's the Yellow Submarine. I love the second side of this album, the purely instrumental score for the movie of the Yellow Submarine. Now, even though I said I'm not a big fan of compilations, this was an album that was donated to me, and that is The Beatles Go to the Movies. And so that has all of their songs from like A Hard Day's Night, Magical Mystery Tour, Help, Let It Be, as well as Yellow Submarine. The other one I got from my uncle, and that is their compilation of their love songs. I know I've already said I'm not a big fan of compilation albums, but this was more of an inherited one. And I believe the gatefold here is actually leather lined. So that's kind of a good addition. So from there, I've got the Paul McCartney album of Band on the Run. Unfortunately, my uncle, whenever I receive anything from my uncle, there's a lot of cutting. I don't know if any of you guys have albums that have that, but yeah, so a lot of the albums that I've received from my uncle and my dad have kind of cutting through the album covers. So Band on the Run, one of those. Now this was actually an album that I have from my mom. This is actually my mom's album, and that is the Beach Boys, Endless Summer, and she actually has her name written on it. I don't know what it was. She liked to write her name on all the album covers. It kind of it hurts me knowing, but you know, that's better to have it. But it has some of my favorite Beach Boys songs on it, like I Get Around, California Girls, Surf and Surfs. But then I have the quintessential Beach Boys album, and that is the re-release of Pet Sounds. Next up is my Klaatu albums. These guys were actually mistaken as the Beatles, which is why they found themselves here. And I have their first album of 340. Anyway, it's like 3:47 Eastern Standard Time, I think is what it's called. It's their first album. It has one of their only hits, which is Calling Occupants. Now we have one of my all-time favorite albums. It earned a spot on my Masterpiece Theater, and that is Klaatu's Hope. I'm not going to get too much into it because I've already talked a lot about it. I've got the full-length album review right up there for you to click on. But this album is one of the few albums that resonated with me so powerfully that it moves me to tears pretty much every time I listen to it. Then I get the kind of follow-ups. I only have one more album from them, and that is Magenta Lane. The main problem that I have with Klaatu is they never really knew if they wanted to be a full-on progressive band or if they wanted to be an accessible poppy band. They tried to balance it out with this one. And some songs work, like Maybe I'll Move to Mars and Magenta Lane are fantastic on here. Million Miles Away is a great song. But a lot of these songs just don't really hit all that well. So from there we have Queen, and I have a Queen bootleg album. It's just kind of written there, and it's a Queen bootleg show. From there we have Sheer Heart Attack, one of my favorite albums from them. They've got The Killer Queen, as well as The Tenement Funster and all those fun ones. Then we have the album that I grew up with and probably my favorite Queen album, which is Night at the Opera. It's got Bohemian Rhapsody, the Prophet song, I'm in Love with My Car, You're My Best Friend, a lot of their staple songs. From there we go to The Who, and I have The Who live at Leeds. We have probably my favorite album from The Who, which is Tommy. Quadrophenia is at the Cottage, so I keep Tommy here in the city. Then we have Who's Next. I love the second side of this album so very much. so much. Such a good album. And then from there we go into Deep Purple with their first album, Shades of Deep Purple. Then we go to their live performance at the Roy Albert Hall, I think it was. Yeah. And I wish more bands would do what these guys did. I mean, these guys, as well as Emerson, Lake and Palmer, constructed a full show that they then recorded and released. And so, brilliant. Then we get to probably their most popular album, which is The Machine Head. It's got Smoke on the Water, got Lazy, it's got Machine, Space Truckin'. And then we have another, probably my favorite live recording from them, which is just Deep Purple in concert. Coming into the home stretch, you guys. Get ready. Then we have a band that is very, very close to Deep Purple, and that is Uriah Heep. I've got Salisbury. I've got Look at Yourself. Now normally this part would be kind of like a foil, so you can kind of, it's like a mirror, but I got one that it fell out of. Then we come into The Magician's Birthday, probably one of their more popular ones. But actually my favorite one is Demons and Wizards. This guy has a lot of amazing tracks on it. The last track on here alone, fantastic, and I actually got the re-release, so it's much fuller, much more deep. Then I've got their live performance of I almost said Deep Purple, Uriah Heep Live, and it has my favorite tracks provided live. So coming in from there, we go into Rush. I don't have a whole lot of Rush, but I have Hemispheres, probably my favorite album from them. Then we come into A Farewell from Kings, as well as their just masterpiece, which is Moving Pictures. From there, we go into the 80s with Marillion. I have their first EP, which is Market Square Heroes, and it also has Grendel. Grendel's so good, you guys. I know, it's a pure ripoff of Supper's Ready, but I don't care. It's still a fantastic album. From there, we have the Script of a Jester's Tear, their first full-length LP. So from there, we have Fugazi, not the greatest follow-up, but that was followed up by Misplaced Childhood. Brilliant, brilliant album. Then we have Clutching at Straws. I actually have two copies of this because this copy is pretty warped, so I had to pick up a second one from that. Then I have the only one from the H era. All of those were Fish, so I have H era of Brave. This is probably my favorite album. No, this one and Marbles, but this guy, oh geez, it's heavy, and I love where it goes as a concept album. Just fantastic. I actually lived in a basement apartment. I still do. A different basement apartment, and it flooded, and this album was on the ground when it flooded, so this part of the album is kind of waterlogged, but I think it works very well with the album overall because, well, the concept of the album. So from there we have Focus, and I have Focus 3. I still haven't had a chance to listen to this. I really need to get down and listen to it. From there, we go into Jeff Wayne's musical rendition of War of the Worlds. I love this album. It's a little poppy and a little disco-y for me, but it still provides such amazing, amazing music. And the final artist that I have is Led Zeppelin. I mean, no album collection would be complete without Led Zeppelin, so I've got their first album, second album, third album, and actually all these guys are reprints. I then have Zeppelin 4, and I think I have another copy of it up at the cottage as well as one at my dad's. We have multiple copies of Zeppelin 4. But we actually have my favorite one, which is Houses of the Holy. This is my favorite Zeppelin album. And then finally, rounding that off, I've got Physical Graffiti because it has some of my favorite tracks on it. It's got Kashmir. Beautiful, beautiful album, and it isn't just a reject album. And then finally, just for giggles, this is a bonus one of Square Dance Party. I bought this for $1. It's just fun. The album's really worn down, and it's got the calls. I do a lot of Contra, which is very similar to square dancing because we have a lot of squares in Contra. And it's just kind of a good time. So that's about it for the 4th edition of this, mainly soundtracks and classical rock. From there, I'm going to dive into my early progressive rock. I'm actually going to start with some of the albums down here on the bottom level that you guys can't see because there's actually a whole nother tier. So yeah, get ready for that. That will be coming out hopefully next week. I don't make any promises, but I hope to get that out very, very soon. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. Let me know what your favorite album from the bunch was. What was the most exciting album? What was the strangest album? Let me know that down below. As always, thank you guys for watching, and until next time, notes out.